The sun hung low in the sky, casting its warm, golden hue across David Miller's backyard. His Adirondack chair creaked slightly under his weight as he reclined into it, his head tilting back to feel the full embrace of the afternoon sun. David closed his eyes, inhaling the familiar, soothing sense of fresh grass, the earthy aroma of his oak tree, and the subtle fragrance of blooming flowers from the neighbor's yard. The gentle breeze, soft as a whisper, rustled through the branches, creating a peaceful symphony that only nature could compose. It was his oasis, his sanctuary, his safe space. After a long, exhausting week at the FBI's local office, this quiet, simple moment was all he needed. He had spent years climbing the ladder, overseeing high-stakes operations, managing cases that dealt with the most dangerous of criminals, and making critical decisions that shaped the safety of his community. But hey, in this backyard, none of that mattered. The weight of responsibility melted away, replaced by the gentle hum of suburban life. David's fingers drummed absent-mindedly on the chair's armrests, synchronizing with the distant hum of lawnmowers from neighboring homes. His teenage son, Malik, was probably out there somewhere, either playing basketball or studying with his friends. His wife, Natalie, was inside preparing dinner, a routine that always brought a sense of normalcy to their home. It was these moments, these brief windows of tranquility, that David cherished the most. He could feel the tension in his shoulders ease. A stolen hour before the whirlwind would drag him back into the daily grind. He let out a long breath, allowing his body to sink deeper into the chair, the creak of the wood echoing in the stillness. But then, the calm shattered. Excuse me. Are you supposed to be here?" David's eyes snapped open, his heart rate immediately spiking. The voice was sharp, urgent, and carried an edge of hostility. He blinked, momentarily disoriented, and turned his head to see the source of the disturbance. A man stood at the edge of his yard. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a faded polo shirt and cargo shorts, his posture stiff and confrontational. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, and his face wore an expression of deep suspicion. David's stomach churned with an immediate sense of unease. He recognized the man instantly. Timmy Fox. Timmy had recently moved into the neighborhood. David hadn't spoken much to him, but he was aware of his tendency to keep a close eye on his neighbors. He'd made casual comments about how things had always been done a certain way around here, suggesting that some changes, people who didn't look like everyone else, were unwelcome. And right now, Timmy was glaring at him, his eyes narrowing with something that felt less like curiosity and more like accusation. "I beg your pardon?" David asked, sitting up straighter in his chair. His voice was calm, but there was a tension beneath it, a realization that something wasn't right. "This is a private residence," Timmy declared, his voice rising slightly. "I don't recognize you. Are you trespassing? Because I'm about to call the police." David's mind raced as he processed his words. A mixture of disbelief and frustration bubbled up, but he kept his voice steady. "I live here," he said, gesturing toward the house behind him. "This is my home." Timmy scoffed, his eyes narrowing even further. "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I've lived here for 2 years, and I've never seen you before. You don't belong here." David's heart sank. Was this really happening? His own backyard, his own home, under attack by someone who knew nothing about him. He looked at Timmy, trying to steady himself. This wasn't just an accusation, it was something much deeper. He had dealt with bias before, subtle or otherwise, but this felt different. This felt personal. Before he could respond, Timmy was already fumbling for his phone. His fingers moved with urgency, and his voice began to rise, piercing the calm. "Yes, hello," Timmy said into the phone, his voice now raised and dramatic. "I'd like to report a trespasser, a suspicious black man in my neighbor's backyard. I don't believe he lives here. I feel threatened." David's jaw clenched. The words hit him like a slap. This wasn't just about trespassing. This was about something far uglier. This was about the assumptions people made about him, about his very existence in a neighborhood that had been mostly white for decades. He took a deep breath, trying to remain composed. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, though the consequences had always been less severe. But this was different. It was his own backyard. The sirens wailed in the distance, a harsh reminder of the impending confrontation. Within minutes, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb. A young officer stepped out, his expression unreadable. David's stomach twisted. He knew this situation was about to escalate, but how far would it go? Officer Miller approached first, his uniform crisp and clean, his steps measured as he crossed the lawn to where Timmy stood, still holding his phone, his gaze never leaving David. The officer listened intently to Timmy as he recounted the details, his voice filled with exaggerated fear. David felt a knot form in his stomach as Timmy's words painted him as a threat. He was being accused, without reason or evidence, of something he hadn't done. The officer's eyes finally shifted toward David. He studied him for a moment, his expression guarded, almost as if assessing whether David posed any threat. "Sir," Officer Miller said, his tone official and cold, "can you explain what you're doing here?" David's breath hitched slightly. He had expected this. This was the script. He had seen it before. But still, the sting was unbearable. He lifted his chin, meeting the officer's gaze. "I live here," David said simply, his voice steady. "This is my property. I'm just relaxing in my backyard." The officer's expression didn't change. He nodded slowly, though there was something in his eyes, a flicker of doubt, or maybe suspicion. David took a deep breath, knowing what came next. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys, holding them up. "Here are my house keys. I'm not a trespasser." Officer Miller examined the keys, though he didn't look at David. Instead, he turned his attention back to Timmy, who was now standing taller, as if victorious. "Officer Miller said, his voice still measured, do you have any proof that this man doesn't live here?" Timmy faltered for a moment, the self-assuredness slipping from his face. "Well, no, not exactly," he stammered. "But I've lived here for 2 years, and I know everyone on this street. I've never seen him before, and he doesn't look like he belongs here." David felt a wave of anger and humiliation wash over him. He had been through this before. The silent bias, the unspoken assumptions based solely on the color of his skin. He wasn't the first person to be misjudged in this way. But the injustice of it all, the sheer audacity of Timmy, the way he wielded his privilege to put him in this position, burned. "Officer," David said, his voice now tinged with frustration, "I live here. I pay taxes here. I have a right to be here." The officer shifted uncomfortably, though his expression remained largely unchanged. "I understand, sir, but I have to follow procedure." He paused, and David could feel the weight of the decision about to be made. "Until we can verify your residency." "Residency? I'm going to have to ask you to leave the property. We'll sort this out later." David's world seemed to tilt, his stomach sinking further. He had to fight to keep his voice steady. "Are you serious?" he asked quietly, his words sharp despite the effort to remain calm. "You asking me to leave my own home?" Officer Miller hesitated. There was a slight flicker of doubt, but it was gone in an instant. The officer stepped back and gestured toward the sidewalk. "Please, sir, I have to follow procedure." David's hands clenched into fists. He was being humiliated in front of his neighbors, in front of his own home, by a system that was supposed to protect him. With a heavy heart, he stood up from the Adirondack chair, the creaking of the wood echoing in the silence between them. He could feel Timmy's gaze burning into his back, the judgment in his eyes sharp. David walked slowly to the sidewalk, the weight of the moment suffocating him. His neighbors were watching, their faces peering from behind curtains. He knew what they were thinking. He was the criminal, not the one sitting in his own backyard, but the one who didn't belong. David pulled out his phone as he walked toward the curb, his fingers trembling slightly. He scrolled through his contacts, eventually landing on Agent Reynolds. He had to make the call. Reynolds. The voice on the other end was gruff but familiar. "It's Miller," David said tightly. "I need you to do me a favor. I'm at my home address. Run my name and address through the local police department. Tell them who I am and what's going on. We need this sorted out." There was a brief silence before Reynolds spoke again. "What's going on, Miller?" "Just do it," David snapped, his patience wearing thin. "And tell them to have Officer Miller call you back." The line went dead. David glanced over at Officer Miller, who was watching him warily. The officer's earlier certainty had begun to crack. He could see it in the officer's eyes. Doubt was creeping in. But Timmy wasn't finished. He was still ranting, his voice rising in indignation. David turned away, focusing on the phone call, determined to resolve this. David waited, the minutes stretching long as he stood on the sidewalk. His eyes flicked to the police cruiser, where Officer Miller stood in quiet conversation with Timmy Fox, who was now fidgeting nervously. Timmy was still talking, but David couldn't hear the words, only the rising tension in his voice. He clenched his phone tighter, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, David's phone buzzed, the vibration cutting through the silence. It was Agent Reynolds. He quickly answered the call. "Reynolds." "David," came Reynolds' gruff voice. "I ran the check. I spoke to the police. The officer who's there, Miller, is the one who responded to the call. And, well, I think you know where this is going." David's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the weight of the words, the knowledge that his identity was about to be revealed in a way that Timmy never expected. "Just tell him who I am," David said, keeping his tone controlled, though inside he was seething. "Tell him I'm the director of the FBI field office. This needs to stop now." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. David could almost hear Reynolds' voice calculating what this meant. "Got it," Reynolds said, a note of urgency creeping into his voice. "I'll have Officer Miller call you back immediately." David hung up, his mind racing. The realization that he would soon be back in control of the situation felt satisfying, but the humiliation still gnawed at him. The officer, once so quick to take Timmy's side, was about to be caught in his own error. The officer had no idea who David was, had not taken a moment to verify the situation before jumping to conclusions. That fact stung more than anything. How quickly people could judge him based on his skin. David took a deep breath and turned toward the officer, who was still talking with Timmy Fox. He saw Timmy's face change as the officer pulled out his phone. The color drained from Timmy's face as he listened to Officer Miller's words. Timmy's expression was one of confusion and realization, as if everything was suddenly shifting beneath him. His gaze flicked nervously toward David. David stood still, unwavering. The longer he stood there, the more he could feel the weight of the situation lifting from him. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore. He was fighting for something much bigger. Officer Miller, after finishing the call with Agent Reynolds, approached David, his steps more hesitant now. His demeanor had completely changed. Gone was the stern, accusatory tone. Instead, there was an almost apologetic air as he cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller," Officer Miller began, his voice noticeably softer. I owe you an apology. There's been a misunderstanding. It turns out you are the director of the FBI field office here. I should have verified your identity sooner." David's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let the words settle, let the officer feel the weight of what he had just said. It wasn't about him as an individual. It was about the assumption that had been made, the prejudice that had allowed this entire situation to happen in the first place. "Officer," David said finally, his voice even but laced with controlled anger, "do you realize that I was just treated like a criminal in my own backyard? By you, someone sworn to protect and serve, simply because I don't fit the image of who's supposed to belong here." The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for the intensity of David's response. I understand, sir," he stammered, clearly flustered. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I'm truly sorry." David shook his head, disbelief creeping into his voice. "It's not about what you meant, officer. It's about what you did. You took someone's word without question. You let a stranger, someone you've never even met, decide my worth, simply based on how I look. You didn't even give me a chance. Do you think that's fair?" The officer opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His eyes flicked to Timmy, who had retreated to a safe distance, now looking like he wanted to shrink into the ground. David didn't wait for more apologies. Instead, he turned his attention to Timmy, who was now standing awkwardly off to the side, avoiding David's gaze. "Timmy Fox," David said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "You used your privilege to attack me. You took the police, the very symbol of protection in this community, and weaponized them against me, simply because you decided I didn't belong. You owe me more than an apology. You owe this entire neighborhood one." Timmy's face turned crimson, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right words, but they never came. He couldn't meet David's eyes, and instead, he shifted uncomfortably on his feet. David continued, his tone unwavering. "You think I don't know what this was about? You assumed that because I'm black, I couldn't possibly live here, that I didn't have the same right to be here as anyone else. Well, Timmy, it's time for you to learn that this is my neighborhood too. This is my home, and I will not be made to feel small because of the color of my skin." Timmy mumbled something, but the words were indistinguishable. His alias self-righteousness was gone, replaced by a palpable fear and shame. David's eyes met the officer's. "I'm filing a formal complaint, Officer Miller, and I'm not done here. I will not let this go." The fallout from the incident was swift. Officer Miller was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Timmy Fox's name spread throughout the community, not as a name of authority or respect, but as one that represented the biases and ignorance that still lurked beneath the surface. The local news caught wind of the story quickly, and soon, it became the center of a debate about systemic racism in the community. Conversations about racial profiling, bias in law enforcement, and the misuse of power began to ripple outward, creating waves of discomfort and change. Timmy's reputation was destroyed. Neighbors who had once looked at him with a degree of respect now saw him for what he truly was. His efforts to ostracize David, to diminish his presence, backfired spectacularly. Timmy's house was put on the market, and within weeks, he was gone, shunned by the very community he had hoped to dominate. For David, the incident was a painful but necessary reminder of how far the fight for equality still had to go. But he didn't let it break him. Instead, it fueled him to do more. He worked with local leaders and advocates to bring about meaningful change, including bias training for the police department and increased efforts to promote racial equity within the community. David's voice became stronger in advocating for justice. He helped establish a scholarship fund for underprivileged youth, aiming to give them opportunities that they would otherwise be denied. As he finally sat back in his Adirondack chair once more, the warmth of the sun on his skin, the gentle breeze rustling the oak leaves above him, David felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: peace. The battle was far from over, but for now, in this moment, he had made a difference. And that was enough.